everybody, and welcome to tonight's virtual class. So first thing really we're going to talk about is just defining what a brim is. It's kind of a slang term for Southerners, I do believe. We're going to talk about that, identifying the different species that fall under that category, locating places to fish, choosing the proper tackle setup and lures, and then even got a little bit of kind of, it's hard to talk about how to dress fish, but we're going to talk about some of the options and some of the favorite ways that I like to cook my brim. So when we talk about brim, it's really not a scientific term. We're generally talking about a fish that's in the sunfish family. Could be called panfish, crappie and other species like that kind of fall into the panfish. But brim, growing up, we're generally talking about bluegill. If somebody says, hey, let's go brim fishing, well, we're probably going to go target bluegill. There's some other species we're fixing to talk about that also might be caught either by accident or on purpose when we're fishing for bluegill. But generally, and kind of the reason we're doing this virtual class right here at the end of April is the spawn is fixing to take place. And when you find bluegill beds in late April and May, you can really catch a bunch of fish. It's one of them deals where me and all my friends, we're crappie fishing, then we're bass fishing, and there's a lot of things going on in the spring. But when those bluegill get on the beds, we kind of stop everything else and we go and we start catching enough of those and filleting them and putting them up in the freezer to last us for a good part of the year. And we're going to talk about how you can do that. So a bluegill, you can see there, they generally get about the size of your hand. That would be a large one. Some of the other species that are going to be targeted in that same brim category is what we grew up calling a shell cracker, but the real name for them is a red ear, is the official name. And these get a little bit bigger. I remember in a NWTF casting kids little tournament at Lake Graham, probably one of the only ones I've ever weighed that was big, but I remember catching one that was 1 pound and 6 ounces. So that's a really, really big shell cracker, but they can get that big. There's a few differences as far as how they spawn and what they feed, and we're going to talk about that when we kind of get into where to find these different species. And then another one that is caught pretty often when we're fishing for brim, and you'll see a lot of these in Middle and East Tennessee along the Clearwater streams. There's a particular place I go to in Louisiana, and for whatever reason that river basin is just full of these, but this is a warmouth, or what I grew up calling them, a goggle eye. But the warmouth is, to my knowledge, the official name, maybe green sunfish, but pretty much every time we've ever caught one in West Tennessee, we've called it a goggle eye. But these fish are shaped, as you can see, a little bit more like a bass. They do have similar feeding habits of bluegill and red ear, and they don't get quite as big, but they are shaped more like a bass, you can tell. And then some other species, there's pumpkin seeds, there's long ears, there's a bunch of different sunfish species that a lot of them really stay pretty small. They're not what we're going to go out and target as far as trying to catch fish for either sport or eating. They just don't get of size. You can see there that pumpkin seed sunfish, that's a really big one. But in general, some of the other sunfish species just don't get quite the size and in abundance as bluegill and red ear. So that being said, let's talk about kind of the life cycle of a brim. And, we're going into the spring, and this is a picture taken from outside the water, obviously. Looks like somebody standing on the ground, of bluegill beds. And you can see they're honeycomb. They look like a honeycomb, basically. Not the bed, not each individual bed is shaped like a honeycomb, but when you're looking at that from a distance or from electronics on your boat, that's what it's really going to look like. You're looking at a series of holes. Generally, they're going to come up and bluegill are going to spawn in, 2 foot, 3 foot or less. I have noticed on reservoirs like Kentucky Lake, Pickwick, it does seem like reservoirs that fluctuate in water, a foot or two each day, or could, pretty regularly. Those fish tend to bed a little bit deeper, which kind of makes sense. If they bed in 2 foot of water and you have a 2 foot fluctuation and their beds wind up being dry, then obviously all the eggs would die. So, but in general, if you're going to go to a pond or a lake, you're going to be looking in under 2 foot. As far as your red ear go, they tend to spawn a little bit sooner than bluegill, and they tend to spawn a little bit deeper than bluegill. So, even though they do eat very similar stuff, as far as if I was going to go target red ear or shell crackers, I'm probably going to not use a float. I'm probably just going to put a split shot above a hook with a cricket or worm, and I'm going to throw out on the bottom in that deeper water to catch shell cracker. And we're going to talk more about methods, but that's just a little bit about that. So in the spring, generally the first full moon in May is kind of what triggers this mass movement of these brim up to spawn. And then this will go on, you can catch fish on the bed all the way up through the first to middle of June. And then they're going to kind of go into their summer haunts. And generally speaking, and I've got some slides later on to just talk about cover, but basically what I'm going to look for in the summer is going to be a little bit deeper water, shaded, around structure that's going to have algae on it, that's going to attract other insects or other bait fish. And that's where you're going to find your brim in the summer. And then as you go into fall and then winter, they're going to pull out deeper. And, it can get pretty tough to catch brim in the winter. It's just everybody, for the most part, kind of stops their search for brim once they get harder to catch on up in late summer and fall and winter. So this next slide, we talked about brim beds looking honeycomb shaped with the eye or from a drone in shallow water. But what this is side imaging on fishing on your electronics. This looks like probably a hummingbird, and they got it set 50 foot left, so you're actually looking in 2.5 foot of water. You're looking 47.5 feet each side of the boat. And this has really changed the game on finding brim beds, specifically shell cracker beds that, as I mentioned, normally spawn a little bit deeper. And, historically, you just didn't see those with the naked eye. But now we've got the electronics out there that you can set, you could even set it out to 100 foot each side of the boat. So I can get up on a shallow flat and turn my side imaging on and basically just scan these pockets until I find a brim bed, mark it, spin around, throw on them. I will say I've noticed fish of the same size tend to hang out together on beds. Now, this is, you might read an article or talk to somebody else and they'll just say, well, that's nonsense. They're all mixed. They all do the same thing. But numerous times I went to a lake, I'll find a brim bed, turn around, I'll throw on it, catch 3 or 4, and they're all, maybe half as big as my hand. And I just kind of leave it. And you go to the next bed and you catch 3 or 4 and they're all big as your hand or bigger. So it does seem like if you're catching small fish that you're not satisfied with for what you're wanting to do with them, there's a good chance you could swap to another bed in that same reservoir and be able to catch a little bit bigger size. That's just my opinion. And then, as I had mentioned, once they get out of that spawning routine and they start going into their summer haunts, what I really looked for was an image of a dock. And, a dock is a great place, wooden docks with shade. If anybody spends a lot of time on the water in the summer, just riding jet skis or pontoons and you're storing it underneath the boat storage facility, a lot of time you'll see bluegill hanging out middle of the water column, just up in the shade. opportunistic feeding. There's bugs attracted to the algae that clings to the docks, clings to the structure, the grass, the trees in the water, and that's where them fish are going to go. Also, you got to think about a bluegill. They are also, they can be preyed upon. A bass really capitalize on brim bedding. It's not uncommon for large mouths to hang around them brim beds and being able to eat and feed on them. So that's a whole nother reason that bluegill cling to that cover. They're kind of hiding in amongst that. Not only are they ambushing and feeding on their own prey, but they're also having to hide from other predator fish. Any questions about, places to look for brim, the spawn, stuff like that? And then what's coming next is going to be talking about tackle and baits and actual setups and a little bit about strategy. Got one question there. How far apart are the beds? And there is no rhyme or reason to it. Sometimes you'll come across a bed. So let's say I'm scanning and I come across and there's only 5 or 6 individual beds on this large brim bed. They could be spaced out pretty big, pretty far apart. But when you get on a big brim bed like what's pictured there, I mean, it's pretty much a foot apart. You're only getting a small space between each individual bed. It's a good question. Henry asked a question, how deep when you say shallow or deeper for red ear? I'm going to say most of your red ear are going to probably build their beds between 4 and 8 foot. It really does depend on the reservoir and stuff, but just thinking about the lakes and stuff around here, it's not uncommon, again, kind of going back to catching a certain size of bluegill on a bed. It's also not uncommon to find a bed that's got shell crackers mixed in with them. That happens pretty often. But when you're finding just a specific shell cracker bed, generally they're out into that, 4 to 8 foot. GD asked some questions around licensing. This is just a general statewide fishing, no special permits, nothing like the trout the trout supplemental stuff, nothing like that for brim. Each individual reservoir does have different size limits, so it's something, on different impoundments you'll just have to check. There's a lot of impoundments that don't have any kind of creel limit. I said size limit. To my knowledge, there's not any reservoirs with a bluegill size limit. Now, there is some with a creel limit. So a creel limit is just how many you can have on you. But that does fluctuate with the different bodies of water, so you just have to check with each one. And I can tell you a little bit about how to find that information here in just a couple slides. Another pretty good question. Are they in the streams or in slow moving water? Pretty much any time you're going to have fish bedding, they're going to go into some calmer waters. They're not going to be out in the current. They're going to be even in a flowing river. They're probably either going to find a back tributary, or they're going to be in a big eddy that, is not going to influence their eggs. Yeah, Missy asked a good question. Is it common to find them from the shore like the picture shown, don't have the technology or a boat? Absolutely. That's why I think that brim fishing is something that everybody can relate to, because if we think about what they're doing this time of year, they're pulling up into that shallow water. That's what they prefer. Well, shallow water is generally around the banks. Pretty much, if you're wanting to pick a pond or pick a lake and you're wanting to start targeting brim, you're going to find pockets. So let's think about the shape of one. Let's just say you got you got points that come out towards the middle. Back in the back of the pockets, the furthest you can get from the center of the lake is almost always where you're going to get brim beds. They're protected from the wind when they get back in those little coves. That's where the shallowest water is. So that would be the starting point for me if you were going to start walking the banks looking for brim. Sherry asked a good question, like on the Tennessee River. I'm going to go to the backs of the creeks. I'm going to get off the main river. I'm going to go back into some of the deep creeks, and then same principle as what I'm talking about with the lakes. I'm going to find those pockets in the backs of those creeks. On the Tennessee River, it's kind of a little different in one way that a lot of times you'll get to the back of the creek and it'll be a huge flat. It basically just turns into mud until, summer pool. Of course, the water is coming up right now. If I was going and looking for brim, I'm going to stick around the channel and then try to find pockets in the backs of the creeks that's shallow. So in other words, shallow water fairly close to the deep creek channels. Raymond asked a good question. Are lakes with more grass more productive for bluegill? We don't have, at least over here in West Tennessee, with a lot of the grass getting killed off Kentucky Lake and Pickwick, we don't have the grass and milfoil like we did 10 years ago. And I would normally say that no, it does not play a factor, but grass is very healthy for a fishery. I spent some time on Gunnersville last year, and I mean, the amount of life in those lakes are just incredible because they do have all that cover. They've got, fish have places to get away. It draws in different insects. It just really revitalizes the river system. But, I'm not going to say that I'm going to not fish one because it's not a grass lake, but I have seen lakes that has a lot of grass, and it does seem to positively affect it. And some of these things we'll probably cover in some coming slides. So I'm going to roll on and start talking about tackle and lures, and then we'll pause again and take some more questions. So the next thing is just talking about the tackle setup. There's a lot of different ways to go about this. When I was brim fishing growing up, I almost always used a little ultralight 5.5, 6 foot long rod. And that's just what we used, but we fished a lot of small rivers, the Hatchie River, some of these small streams, and there's a lot of overhanging branches and things that you're trying to flip under and fishing out of small boats. And there's definitely nothing wrong with that. You can throw a really small lure when you're doing that. But I've kind of, over the years, transitioned to longer rods, 6.5 foot or 7 foot medium or medium light rods. And that's really, when I'm talking about that, I'm talking about a spinning rod and reel. Using 8 or 10 pound monofilament, that kind of goes for either one. If you do hang, you got strong enough line at 10 pounds and it don't seem to bother the fish, they're not spooky to it, that you can sometimes just grab your line and pull on it and straighten those little brim hooks so you get it back, you can bend it back straight, go back to fishing instead of breaking off. Also, it's not uncommon when you're fishing with live bait especially to hang a bluegill or a shellcracker deep. So in other words, it's too deep for you to get it with your fingers. By having a little bit stronger line, you can kind of reach through their gills or pull on the line and pull that hook loose. Obviously not good for the fish either way, but that is just the reality of it. But that is one benefit of having a little bit stronger line instead of 4 or 6 pound test. And then also your casting reels. Generally when you're talking about a casting rod and reel, you probably will go to a little bit shorter rod. A 6 foot medium light or medium would be fine. And it really comes down to what you're going to be doing. Another scenario that's not pictured is using a pole, like a 10 foot dobbing pole. And one of the situations I use that a lot is if I'm fishing from a boat around like cypress trees or fish that's bedded around cypress trees, I can take that jigging pole, whether I'm using a bobber or I'm just tight lining that lure, and I can get that bait right up against those cypress trees underneath the limbs. And it's a really fun way of fishing. So it really does come down to kind of personal preference and kind of the way you're fishing, type reservoirs you're fishing. So that being said, my number one technique, especially when it comes to bed fishing, is a slip float. Now, there's different kind of bobbers that can clip to your line. So either way, I'm going to have a hook and a split shot, and then I'm going to have some kind of bobber. So the reason that I like a slip bobber or a slip float is because it seems to be easier to cast. So let's just say I'm setting my depth at 24 inches deep. Well, if I'm doing that with just a clip-on bobber, I've got to put that bobber 24 inches from my hook, right? When I'm throwing a slip float, I'm able to put my bobber stopper up 24 inches up my line. My bobber sets down against my split shot, and then I'm able to throw that thing so much better because I'm only throwing about 8 inches of weight. It's not awkward. If I'm throwing underneath limbs, I'm not like throwing this big, like throwing a wide spaced, lure in there. So that's my opinion on the slip float. I can quickly adjust my depth, and then especially for red ear, or sometimes if the fish are just not wanting what you're presenting them, you can go to something where you can throw it on the bottom. I'm going to put just a lead split shot, come down 8 inches, put my hook, and throw it out there on the bottom. You can kind of keep just a little bit of slack. That way, if you are moving or the boat's moving, you're not dragging that thing every time, the line gets tight, and just kind of let the bait do its job. Richard asks, what's the distance between the split shot and the stop knot? Does the bead... So I don't use a bead. The slip floats that I use are small enough on the end that it does not pull over my bobber stopper, if that makes sense. The only purpose of a bead is because a lot of times the bead has a smaller hole through it, so it for sure stops on your bobber stopper. I use a rubber bobber stopper, so you can probably Google that. It's just a lot better efficient method than the one that was pictured with the line. It seems to last forever. I mean, I can put one on my brim fishing rod, and even if I do break off, it very rarely breaks off above that bobber stopper. I mean, I could use one for 2 or 3 years sometimes. So that's what I do. And then as far as the distance, that all depends on the depth that you're wanting to fish. Because let's think about this. When you throw it out there, the lead falls to the bottom or starts sinking, right? The lead and the hook. And then the line is pulling through your bobber, and then it stops at the bobber stopper. So wherever you put your bobber stopper on your line is going to be the depth in which your bait is sitting under the water. Darius asked, like on a bottom rig, I assume you're talking about, do you let it fall all the way to the bottom? And yes, in this case, I do. It's not going to be retrieved or trying to keep it up in the water column. I'm throwing it out there to let it set on the actual bottom, especially for red ear. Missy asked a question about, does the color of line matter? No, it don't. Sometimes I'll use clear monofilament, but I got a lot of fluorescent yellow, and it's easy to see. If you get a day like today where the wind's blowing, you're trying to fit this line through the eye of a hook, and all these things are going on. It kind of helps to have that little bit of visibility on the line, and I don't see where it's played any factor on the amount of fish you catch. A question about, would the slip float scare them off the bed? Nah. If you're on some heavily pressured fish and they're just boat after boat pounding a bed, maybe it would play a factor. But I always like to throw past the bed and then retrieve the bait real quickly and then let it set on it. I'm not just, it's all about presentation. And I'm also getting by with as small of split shot and small of bobber that I can for the wind and the situation that I'm throwing. And that kind of goes back to why I like a 7-foot medium light rod is I can take a pretty light bait or a light slip float rig and throw that thing a long ways. If you put one of those big round bobbers, big as your fist, with a 1 ounce weight and threw it out there in the middle of the brim bed, yeah, it probably would spook them. But for the most part, you're trying to get by with as little as possible to still be able to cast it. One thing that will run the brim off a bed, I will say this since you brought that up. A lot of times those brim beds will have a log that runs through it, or there'll be a bush over here. And it does seem like if you throw out there and you hang that log or you hang that treetop and you're doing a bunch of jerking on it, and it's making bubbles where it's moving on the bottom, that will disturb them fish for a little while, and they might leave, and then you'll have to go somewhere else and fish for a little while, and then generally within 20 or 30 minutes they'll start filtering their way back to their beds. But I have noticed that. Now let's talk about some of the lure and bait options. Generally, when you're talking about brim fishing, most people are going to use live bait, and I'm going to say 90% of the people are going to use either crickets or red worms. I say red worms because they're the smallest, basically, that you can go readily buy. They make I think it's called a red wiggler or something like that. And then obviously like night crawlers. If you go to Walmart and you buy them a night crawler now, when you buy it from Walmart, it's like 12 to a box and they're big around as your pinky. Not to say that won't work, but you're going to wind up having to cut just a little nail-sized chunk of that bait to put on your brim hook. When you do that, you're just, you don't have any motion. Well, what you can do with that red worm is you can, basically what I'll do, I'll take one that's, let's say, 2.5 inches long or 2 inches long, and I'll take my brim hook and I'm going to spare about, let's say, 3/4 of an inch, and then I'm going to come kind of towards that middle part of the body. I'm going to thread it on the hook, and then I'm going to come out of that worm about 3/4 of an inch on the other end. So what that allows is I've got 2 different ends with 3/4 of an inch hanging off my hook that's squirming, and that really makes a big difference, as far as that bait being able to move and draw fish. So that's why I say red worms. You can get by with other types. Same thing with a cricket. A cricket is to be hooked from the back end, and then I normally bring the hook out kind of their chest. A lot of the times when you miss one, it's almost always they've ate the head of that cricket. They want to eat it head first for whatever reason. But by hooking them like what I'm talking about, that cricket stays alive a lot longer and you got motion in the water. Some other live bait options, and when we start talking about some of these different artificial lures, wax worms, they really look just like a maggot, truth be told. They're about, I don't know, big as your pinky nail, and they can be used by themselves, but pretty much the way me and my friends use a wax worm is by tipping them on like a hair jig. So you take a 64th ounce hair jig, or if anybody's familiar with, some of the different, nymphs and all these different things that's normally used for trout, and you can tip that same little 64th or 32nd ounce jig with a wax worm, and to me it just gives a little bit of scent along with that visual and motion. So that would be the only other thing I would probably throw in the live bait category. And then that brings us to artificial stuff. So there's a bunch of different options out there. So if you followed along on some of the other virtual classes I've done on different fishing species, you've seen that bait on the top before, and that's what's called a Strike King Slabalicious. It's a 2 inch long really a crappie bait. But even at an inch and a half or 2 inches long, a big bluegill or a red ear or especially a goggle eye will absolutely eat that. You can use it along with a blade like that Roadrunner there, or you can just throw it on a jig head. Generally, if I'm going to throw one on a jig head, I'm going to throw it about an 1/8 ounce head. I find fits that size lure pretty well. And then pictured on the right, probably if you done a poll across all of America and said, hey, what bait have you caught more fish on than any other? A beetle spin is one of the most universal baits, kind of like that slabalicious. It catches anything from bass to brim to crappie, and you buy them actually kind of set up like that, or you can buy that blade and jig head and artificial lure separate. A really good lure for catching brim. You're throwing either one of those out there. You're going to let it sink to the depth that you want it, and then you're just going to make a steady retrieve. And then also here, you've got a float and fly. It's not uncommon for people to actually throw this on a fly rod. And here on this next slide, this was something Taylor Fox added when he done this virtual class last year, and that's just putting some kind of a streamer behind that floating popper. You're basically using that floating popper as a strike indicator with a streamer below it. This would be a great situation to put that wax worm on that, along with that streamer on that hair jig part. But there's a lot of different options, and I'm all about simplicity. There's a lot of days that I just spontaneously go and go fishing, or I'm bass fishing and I run across brim beds and I don't have live bait. And I've really found that those little bitty, like the nymphs or the different, what we just call a hair jig, it's got a very small hook on a 64th ounce head or 82nd ounce head. And you can throw those out there under a float or behind a popper like that. And, you can catch them sometimes just as good as you had live bait. So it's definitely worth keeping that kind of stuff in your boat or in your tackle box as you're fishing, if nothing else, for opportunistic brim fishing. So the next slide is going to move us into talking about finding places to fish in Tennessee. So if there's any questions around tackle, setups, strategy, casting, anything like that, let's go ahead and do those. Edward asked, can you use a fly on a spinning rod? And you can, but it really, that kind of goes back to why me and my uncle and some other people are using those like weighted nymphs. They make one that's a tungsten head. They're a little bit more pricey, but I mean, they got a good hook in them. And they stay small, but you got enough weight that you can throw it with a spinning rod. A lot of time what you're going to run into with a fly is it's going to be too light to throw. But you can definitely throw one, especially if it's got a little weight to it, below a bobber. That's really about the way we use them. We'll throw like an 82nd ounce hair jig or a fly underneath a bobber or underneath some kind of pop and float. And it gives you just a little bit more weight to be able to throw it with a spinning rod. Judy asked a question about making your own lures, and absolutely you can. I would recommend, if you have an Orvis store anywhere around you, about once a month they'll do fly tying, and I'm pretty sure their classes are free. Very, very, very intelligent people that fish a lot. And they could probably really teach you a lot about doing stuff like that. I'm not a good one to ask advice, but definitely there's a lot of people that use some of that stuff to make their own flies and own lures. Raymond asks, what are some of the better small lakes for bluegill? And you can make me tell you all my secrets. Now, some of my favorite ones is all the Beach River watershed development lakes. So everything around Lexington, Piney, Beach. Beach has got some giant bluegill in it. What's some of them other ones? Redbud. All of those are good. Lake Graham in Jackson is really good. Whiteville Lake in Hardeman County is really good. Man, it's really more that what's not good. There's a lot of really good lakes around, but that's just a very small list. There's 4 or 5 that I fish. Edward asked, what baits or techniques can you use around lily pads? You know, they make a lot of different weedless jig heads and weedless baits. You can almost see, it looks like some of these poppers that are pictured here kind of have that, and it's basically a weed guard to keep that hook from hanging. So I would probably look at something like that. You can probably do a Google. I just bought some that were 16th ounce weedless jig heads that I'm crappie fishing with, and I absolutely love them. I'm sure that you can Google like 32nd or 64th ounce weedless jig heads or something with a weed guard, and you can find those. And then also I know that they make, I believe what they call it is a mosquito hook, and they make some that's got that wire weed guard on it. So, you know, I really have become a bigger fan of that stuff than I used to, because I haven't found a trade-off. I'm not losing any fish because of that weed guard, but I don't ever hang. So it's really hard not to use them. Darius asked a question, are they attracted to light? Definitely in the summer. You know, I haven't fished a lot at night for them, but I know those people that put those green lights that attract bugs and minnows and all that stuff in the water. There's definitely bluegill that get around them. All right, some really good questions. And we'll circle back up. We're getting down to about the last 15 minutes, so at the end we'll take some more, but I just want to talk to you guys about using this boating and fishing app. This is in Go Outdoors. If you've got the app on your phone, or you go to Go Outdoors Tennessee on the website, you can find this, and this is an interactive map. And, you know, we had some questions earlier about size limit, creel limits for different species. This is the place that you can find that. So it looks like here, you know, it's zoomed in around the Nashville area. We're looking at Percy Priest. Actually, it looks like they clicked on, yeah. So the waterway is the Cumberland River. It's got a lot of information about the ramp, things like that. And then you can also click on regulations or statewide regulations, and that's where you're going to find those individual impoundment regulations. So if I click on Percy Priest and then I click on, you know, regulations, that's going to be the reservoir specific creel and size limit. Whew. Judy asked a question about the blood knot and the streamer. So let's go back to that. You know, I'm not a fly fisherman. That is some fly fishing terminology. A blood knot is just a knot that is used to mend 2 lures together, or two lines together. And basically that was a way, like on number 3, that they're tying that in front of that lure off that leader. Long story short, mostly what I would see doing is number 1, where you're just tying just a regular, you could tie any kind of knot to the back of the eye of the hook, or the bend of the hook, and then just run a leader, which is your line from hook to the next one. And that's what that is. All right. And where you can find that, like I said, you can go to the app, or you can go to the, I believe it's the fish or the boat that's down on the bottom part of that app. And then if you have your phone handy and you're not using it to follow along on this virtual class, there's the QR code to it. My favorite part. So there's several different ways that you can dress your brim. whether it be bluegill, red ear. Sometimes with red ear, because they are bigger, I tend to fillet them more. And if I have a whole lot of big bluegill, more than I care to try to scale and eat whole, then I'll fillet them. But a whole lot of the time, I find myself scaling them. Now, pictured on the left, it looks like somebody skinned those. And they probably took like catfish skinners and they grabbed on that skin and they pulled it off. But if I'm going to eat brim whole, like pictured on the right, I like to leave that skin on them because it does seem to give them better taste. But what you'd have to do is generally, I still, even though they make a lot of scaling knives and things like that, which is nothing but basically a butter knife, I use a spoon. I use a tablespoon. I get it in my hand and I rake those scales backwards and they come right off. You got to get around the fins and around the tail, and then basically to remove the inside parts, I'm just cutting its head off right behind the gills, and then you can take your finger and rake it in and rake all that stuff out. So that's probably my favorite way of dressing them and eating them. Generally, when I'm doing that, it don't take just a giant bluegill for me to keep it, something 2/3 big as your hand is plenty big enough to eat whole like that. If you're planning on filleting them, you probably want to keep what we call number ones, just the biggest ones. But either way, I'll share with you some of my favorite ways of cooking them. Whether you got fillets or you've got the whole fish scaled. And this is where it comes down to personal preference, but you can definitely just drain the water off of them and I actually put them on like a paper towel or something to kind of get them where they're just not plumb wet, and then you can batter them in your fish mix. Or if you're wanting a little bit more batter to cling to them, to make them a little flakier when you fry them, you can use some milk and then add an egg, kind of maybe put a little bit of seasoning in there with it or salt. Don't get too carried away, especially if you're going to use what I'm talking about next. But I like a fish mix. A lot of people like just flour, or a lot of people like just cornmeal. Me personally, I like Tony Chachere's fish mix. They actually make a flour-based and a cornmeal-based fish mix. And then Andy's, they make a red and a yellow and a Cajun, and all that is different spice levels. I like the red. Cajun's probably the hottest. Yellow is more mild. Either way, I like to salt my fish before I batter them. And then once you've got them battered, again, lots of different ways. I think when Taylor Fox taught this last year, I can still see in the notes where he's using coating them in like crumbs, in breadcrumbs or whatever. So it really does come down to like what texture you like. If, again, flour, cornmeal, crumbs, it's all going to produce somewhat the same result. But we're going to get our grease. I use just like a fried Eddie, something that you're actually deep frying them in. So if you're using just a skillet, you got to put enough to get over the fillet or the whole fish. Especially if you're doing a whole one, you're probably going to need about 1.5 inches of grease. Don't matter what kind. I use vegetable oil. And then get it up to about 360, 370. And depending on the size, if you're cooking whole ones, you probably want to go for about 6 minutes. If you're cooking fillets, you can probably get by with 4 or 5. You don't want to overcook them, but just kind of a golden brown. Remove them from your grease and put them on a bed of paper towels, or just let them drain. And that is some really, really good eating. So any questions about all that good stuff that we've covered? And pictured there is, it looks like I guess that's probably a fly or a nymph. Looks like a weighted head on it. So it's kind of what you would look at as far as a size. All right, guys, I think we're pretty much to the end of it. I'll stick around and answer any questions you got, but if you will, just take a second and answer any. Judy asked the question, is it okay to leave the scales and guts at the fishing site? Well, one, I'm going to fish when it's time to fish, and I'm not going to take the time to dress them right there anyway. So, I mean, I'm always putting them in a cooler with ice, and then once I get home, or if you put enough ice on them, you can wait and dress them the next day. But either way, yeah, it's unsightly for somebody that, maybe they've never fished and they don't really have an open mind to the concept of fishing and keeping what you catch. So it's just keeping others in mind. And if they was to stumble across that, I would always remove that with you. All right, guys, thank you. So the answer to your knowledge check-ins: identify which gender of bluegill, protect the eggs. That's the male. The female will come in, lay the eggs, and then the male will protect them. And then, as mentioned, the shape of a bluegill bed. So when we're talking about all the bluegill beds together, if you look at it, it's going to look a lot like a honeycomb, where a lot of them, if there's a bunch of them there, they're going to be spaced about a foot apart. And then select where you can find the best free maps for fishing in Tennessee. That's going to be the TWRA app or Go Outdoors. Any other questions? All right, thank you guys for joining. As always, if you think of more questions or you have a good brim fishing experience, I would love to just kind of see how you took what you learned tonight and went and caught some brim. Send me some pictures. My email's on the website, but anytime, just feel free to reach out.